Why do people run away from holy places, particularly intense spiritual locations such as Arunachala? Let's find out. As people progress on the spiritual path, sometimes there is a need to go to an intense spiritual location or to go to a guru or a teacher and so forth and so on. But sometimes when people get to that spiritual location, or even if they get to the teacher, sometimes there is this yearning to run away because it's so intense. The energy there is something completely different than what they thought of. And so there's this need to get as far away as possible from that location. Now, I remember the great Lakshmana Swami, who was a devotee of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi when he was alive, who said something similar to, if there is not sufficient sattva, that person may not do well next to Arunachala. Now, first, before we get into the nuts and bolts of Lakshmana Swami's quote here, first we need to understand what Arunachala is. And I have a whole video on Arunachala, which I'll put in the description. And first, you need to understand that Arunachala is what we would call a Tejo Lingam, which we could translate that as a column of fire of light, which has no beginning nor end. And I explain a lot about this in that video that I highly recommend that you go and watch. But Arunachala is that Tejo Lingam. So in the Shaiva tradition in India, you'll see the image of the Lingam, the Shiva Lingam. And so the Tejo Lingam is like the grand Lingam of Shiva. So Arunachala is that Shiva Lingam, that Tejo Lingam. And Shiva here is a representation of the ultimate reality of Brahman, which we are all a part of through the Atman within us, which is the undifferentiated consciousness, which is identical to Brahman. Hence, Sri Ramana Maharshi was drawn to Arunachala because he had an intense self-realization where he was permanently abiding in the Atman. And so he was drawn to the holy mountain because it is said that those who have a realization are naturally drawn to Arunachala. And it is actually a representation of what has happened within them. So as a result, an ashram was built around Ramana Maharshi while he was alive. And we are all blessed in this day and age that we can visit that ashram when we go to the city of Tiruvannamalai. And so that's what Arunachala is, right? So Lakshmana Swami is saying that if we don't have sufficient sattva, we cannot reside at the foot of Arunachala or even go to Ramana Ashram. We won't last long, right? And so what is sattva? Now, sattva is part of the three gunas. Now, sattva is the purity element of the three gunas. And so the other two gunas are rajas, which is passion, movement, activity. And then there is also tamas, which is like laziness, inertia, and also ignorance, which is important, right? Because a lot of people are ignorant to the ultimate reality around them, which would make someone tamasic. Now, as Lakshmana Swami said, if we don't have sufficient sattva, we won't last long at a spiritual location, particularly an intense spiritual place such as Arunachala, because we haven't developed or don't have enough sattva within us. We may be too rajasic, we may be too tamasic, and we'll just want to get the hell out of town. Now, there's similar ideas also in Buddhism where you have shamatha. Now, shamatha means tranquility or peaceful abiding. And so you have this, in some sense in Buddhism, you have this preliminary stage where you need to develop tranquility in your mind and in your life in general, which then leads to vipassana, insight. And likewise, within Advaita Vedanta, you've got this aspect within Advaita, which is Jnana Yoga. Like Advaita Vedanta could be considered a Jnana Yoga path, where Jnana means the knowledge of Brahman, right? And so those who are usually drawn to Arunachala have had some sort of realization. Maybe they don't abide in the Atman completely, but there's a yearning to go to the mountain because they've had that realization. But in saying that, sometimes even if you had a realization, you don't have sufficient sattva. Sometimes the sattva, like with shamatha in Buddhism, is something that we develop over long periods of time through meditative practice, through being more disciplined in our life, through having better interactions with people and interactions with the world and so forth and so on, right? So we can develop sattva over long periods of time, and usually that's how it operates. A lot of us are not as blessed as Sri Ramana Maharshi, where we have a realization and then we're permanently abiding in Brahman. But at the same time, even though we may not be that blessed, we are blessed in a sense because we can just continually develop through following the sattvic path, which then will draw us to places such as Arunachala. But sometimes people go to Arunachala when they're not ready for it, right? And look, do I wholeheartedly agree with Lakshmana Swami with what he said? Not completely, but Lakshmana Swami is not saying that not all people go there. It's just that you may not last that long, right? And so if you go to Tiruvannamalai, you might see some people who are behaving very weirdly, and they probably don't have sufficient sattva to be there, but they've just completely dropped out of society and they're just living there because it's cheap to live, and they have no connection to the mountain or Ramana, and they're just really living there as an ordinary person. And there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, the whole place is imbued with this spiritual atmosphere that you feel it moves through your bones. But if you haven't developed enough sattva, you won't feel that. I've taken people to Arunachala before, and some people don't feel it at all because they get overwhelmed by the environment around them. Sometimes it's a dusty little town, Tiruvannamalai. And so people get overwhelmed by the dust. Sometimes there's a lot of crowds there, particularly when there's Deepam. And so there can be a lot of people, but often there's not that many people in town. For me, because I've traveled a lot in India, I'm never overwhelmed in Tiruvannamalai because it's not like going to Varanasi, for example, where Varanasi is full power 24/7, where Tiruvannamalai is a small town of 150,000 people that does get overwhelmed, particularly at Kartikai Deepam towards the end of the year when millions of people show up. But often it's not like that. It's a really quiet town, and it's not one that I would think people would get overwhelmed with. But if you're coming from particular parts around the world, then maybe you're overwhelmed initially. But those who are ready to be there will be able to reside there. And so in saying that, even if you weren't ready to be there, I would say give yourself some time to be there and be present there, and go to the ashram each day, circumambulate Arunachala, and just be there and be in the environment and connect with the locals. The local Tamil people, particularly in Tiruvannamalai, are just sweethearts. Some of the best people that you will meet. An absolutely wonderful place. Gayang and I, when we travel to Tiruvannamalai, some of our most memorable times in Tiruvannamalai is just sipping a tea on Pradakshina Road around Tiruvannamalai. And so you're probably asking, well, how can I develop enough sattva to reside at a spiritual location like Arunachala? Well, one of the key elements in Advaita Vedanta and in Sanatana Dharma in general is this idea of Sakshi Bhava. Now, Sakshi Bhava is witness consciousness. And so this is a big part of spiritual practice in general. It doesn't matter if it's Advaita Vedanta, it's also part of Dzogchen within Vajrayana Buddhism. And so you find this type of practice languaged and called different things within many different non-dual schools throughout Asia. And so once you start practicing Sakshi Bhava, you then start to distance yourself in some sense from the jiva that you believe you are, this ego persona system, right? So you are developing what would be called viveka in Sanskrit, discernment between what is real and what is not. So you're looking within your mind, you're noticing these aspects of the persona that are kind of weighing your natural self down. Now, when I say natural self here, I'm talking about Atman, the undifferentiated consciousness. So when you are practicing Sakshi Bhava, you are abiding in the Atman. And when you abide in the Atman, you can see things play out as they will be, but you're not reacting to what is going on within you. Now, it doesn't say that you stop acting altogether. It just means that 90% of the time, there are a lot of things that our jiva and even our subconscious sort of burp up into our conscious mind are not really relevant. But we're acting upon a lot of that, which causes a lot of harm to others, and a lot of the time it causes a lot of harm to ourselves, so we suffer. And so you're in this perpetual cycle of suffering because you're reacting to what's going on within you, even though 90% of it, like I said, is not even useful. And so the more you practice Sakshi Bhava, the more you realize that, and the more sattva you begin to develop. And so in developing more sattva, you become more calm, more pure, and more present, which allows you to be drawn then to a place such as Arunachala. Like I said, those who practice jnana yoga, or those who have a realization of jnana, which means the knowledge of Brahman or just knowledge simply, are naturally drawn to a place like Arunachala. Just as the great sage of the 20th century, Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, was also drawn to the holy mountain of Arunachala. Shanti, shanti, shanti.